I never thought a single, crumbling piece of 19th century paper could hold enough destructive power to obliterate a woman's entire existence. But as my eyes traced the faded ink of the 1842 Middlesex County arrest ledger, I felt an unholy, terrifying grin stretch across my face. My mother-in-law, a woman who had spent the last 5 years terrorizing me with the phantom weight of her aristocratic bloodline, who had looked down her surgically enhanced nose at my parents and called them sturdy peasant stock in a room full of people, was a fraud. She wasn't the great-great-great-granddaughter of Lord Archibald Vance. She was the spawn of Bartholomew Cobb, a syphilitic illiterate horse thief who stole a dead man's identity to escape a hanging. I sat in the dim light of the university archives, the hum of the microfiche machine vibrating through my fingertips, and I realized I had just been handed the nuclear launch codes to my own family dynamic. The sheer, intoxicating rush of malicious joy was entirely foreign to me. I was a historian, a quiet archivist trained to preserve the past, but in that breathless, silent moment, looking at the mugshot equivalent of a 19th century grifter, I decided to become an executioner. I was going to burn Aliner's kingdom to the ground, and I was going to use her own vanity to light the match. To understand how I arrived at this cold, calculated precipice, you have to understand the toxic ecosystem I had been living in for half a decade. I am not a vindictive person by nature. My entire career is built on patience, dust, and silence. I am an archivist and historian for our state's historical society. I spend my days painstakingly restoring letters from the Civil War and cataloging the mundane, beautiful realities of everyday people who built this country. I love my work, and my appreciation for the working class isn't just academic, it's genetic. My parents, Frank and Helen, are the human embodiment of elbow grease. My father has been a union pipefitter for 40 years. His hands are permanently calloused, his knuckles scarred from decades of wrestling with heavy steel and wrenching pipes in freezing trenches. My mother worked for 30 years as a cafeteria manager at a local public high school, a job she took entirely so she could be on the same schedule as my brother and me. They aren't wealthy. They don't know the difference between a salad fork and a dessert fork, and they couldn't care less about vintage wines. What they do possess is an unbreakable moral compass, an endless reserve of warmth, and the kind of fierce, protective love that makes a house a home. They sacrificed every luxury so I could go to college and pursue a master's degree in history. They are my heroes. And then there is Aliner. I met my husband, Mark, during my second year of grad school. He was an architect, sweet, steady, and incredibly handsome. He had a quiet demeanor that balanced out my frantic, deadline-driven anxiety. We fell in love quickly, bonding over long walks through historic neighborhoods. Mark was wonderful, but looking back, there was always a shadow hovering over our relationship, a specter he referred to with a mixture of dread and exhausted resignation. His mother. She's particular, Mark warned me before our first meeting. She's very into genealogy and family history. Just smile and nod. Don't take anything she says personally. I thought I knew what particular meant. I expected a snooty country club mom with a penchant for matching floral prints and subtle judgments about my unmanicured nails. I was entirely unprepared for Aliner Vance. Aliner didn't just live in a house. She held court in a meticulously curated museum dedicated to her own alleged superiority. The Vance residence was a sprawling, overly ornate McMansion tucked away in a gated community, decorated in a style I can only describe as aggressively faux Victorian. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the sun. Antique mahogany tables were polished to a mirror shine, strictly off-limits to anything as pedestrian as a coaster. But the centerpiece of her home, and her entire personality, was the massive, imposing oil portrait hanging above the living room fireplace. It was a painting of Lord Archibald Vance. According to Aliner, Lord Archibald was a towering figure of 19th century British nobility, a man of immense wealth, culture, and power, who tragically had to leave his ancestral estates behind due to some vaguely described political persecution to start anew in America. Aliner spoke of him not as a distant ancestor, but as if he were a beloved roommate who had just stepped out for a cup of Earl Grey. Our first meeting set the tone for the next 5 years of my life. I had worn a simple, neat navy dress, something I thought was respectful and conservative. Eleanor, draped in cashmere, looked me up and down with eyes like a raptor, assessing a particularly unappetizing field mouse. "Oh," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How wonderfully practical. Mark told me you work in a library. I suppose one doesn't need to dress up to sit in the dust." "I'm an archivist, Mrs. Vance," I corrected politely, smiling through the immediate spike of irritation. "I work with primary historical documents." "Yes, well," she sighed, waving a hand dismissively, her diamond rings catching the light. "Someone has to organize the paperwork, I suppose. Not all of us can rely on a legacy. Tell me, dear, where do your people come from?" When I proudly told her my father was a pipefitter and my mother worked at a school, her face contorted into an expression of profound pity. "A plumber," she breathed out, as if I had just confessed he was a gravel-robber. "How incredibly grounded. You must be so proud of your humble beginnings. We Vances, of course, have always carried the heavy burden of leadership. Lord Archibald believed that those of superior breeding have a duty to guide the lower classes." I looked at Mark, expecting him to jump in, to defend me or at least change the subject. Instead, he was intensely focused on his water glass, his jaw tight. Later, in the car, when I exploded about her blatant classism, Mark used the phrase that would become the suffocating mantra of our marriage. "Babe, please. Just keep the peace. It's just how she is. If you argue with her, she'll make our lives hell. Just let her have her delusions." So I kept the peace. Because I loved Mark, I swallowed my pride. I smiled through the 1,000 tiny paper cuts of Eleanor's snobbery. I endured the wedding planning, where Eleanor constantly threatened to hijack our modest, beautiful garden ceremony to turn it into an event worthy of the Vance bloodline. When my parents offered a generous $5,000 toward the catering, money I knew they had painstakingly saved, Eleanor scoffed loud enough for the wedding planner to hear, remarking that $5,000 would barely cover the ice sculptures, let alone a menu fit for refined palates. I endured the holidays, where my gifts to her, carefully selected first edition books, were received with tight-lipped smiles and immediately relegated to a dusty guest room, while she gifted me things like etiquette books, heavy-duty hand lotion for those rough working-class jeans, and gym memberships. Every conversation with Eleanor eventually led back to the Lord. If we were discussing politics, she would mention how Lord Archibald would have handled the economy. If we were eating dinner, she would lament that modern food lacked the refinement of the banquets Lord Archibald used to host. She used her fictitious aristocratic blood as a bludgeon, a universal trump card to assert dominance over everyone in her orbit, but especially over me. I was the commoner who had infiltrated her pristine gene pool. I was a genetic disappointment she was forced to tolerate. For 5 years, I played the game. I let her win. I nodded at the portrait. I ignored the barbs. I watched my husband fold himself into a smaller and smaller version of himself just to avoid her wrath. I absorbed the toxicity because I thought that was what being a supportive partner meant. Until the Thanksgiving dinner. It was a milestone anniversary year for Eleanor and Mark's father, a quiet, defeated man who essentially lived in his golf cart to escape his wife. Eleanor decided to host a massive, catered Thanksgiving anniversary dinner. For the first time in years, she invited my parents. I was hesitant, but my parents, ever the optimists, insisted on going to support Mark. The evening was a disaster from the moment we crossed the threshold. Eleanor had invited several of her high society friends, women who looked like they were constructed entirely of Chardonnay, pearls, and Botox. The dining table was an intimidating landscape of crystal and silver. My parents arrived looking their absolute best. My dad wore his only suit, a slightly outdated but meticulously pressed charcoal two-piece. My mom wore a lovely emerald blouse. I thought they looked wonderful. Eleanor greeted them at the door like a charity case she had been forced to sponsor. "Frank, Helen," she declared loudly to the foyer. "How brave of you to venture out of your usual element. Come in, come in. Don't worry about the floors, the maid comes tomorrow." My dad, bless him, just smiled and handed her a bottle of wine. "Thanks for having us, Eleanor. Beautiful home." As the night wore on, the alcohol flowed, and Eleanor's volume increased. She began holding court at the head of the table, steering the conversation, as always, to the sacred Vance lineage. She regaled her friends with fabricated tales of Lord Archibald's bravery, his vast estates, his pure, untainted bloodline. I was seated next to my mother, gripping my fork so hard my knuckles were white. Mark was across from me, giving me pleading don't say anything looks. Then, one of Aliner's friends, a woman named Beatrice, leaned forward. Aliner, it truly is a shame how rare good breeding is these days. You can always tell who comes from good stock, can't you? It's in the bone structure, the posture. Aliner's eyes gleamed. She looked directly down the length of the table, her gaze bypassing me entirely to land on my mother, who was quietly trying to figure out which spoon to use for her soup. Oh, absolutely, Beatrice, Aliner said, her voice projecting clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. Genetics are destiny. Take Archibald's line, centuries of careful cultivation. It's like breeding thoroughbred racehorses. You wouldn't mix a champion stallion with a draft horse. The table went completely silent. Aliner took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, keeping her eyes locked on my parents. No offense, of course, Frank Helen, we need draft horses. Someone has to pull the plows and fix the pipes. It's noble work in its own dirty way. But one must acknowledge the inherent differences in pedigree. It's just science, really. Sturdy peasant stock serves a purpose, but it simply lacks the refinement required for true greatness. I pray every day that Mark's genetics are strong enough to override the more common traits when he and your daughter finally have children. My heart stopped, the air in the room vanished. A few of the society women tittered nervously, hiding their smirks behind their wine glasses. I looked at my mother. A dark, furious flush was creeping up her neck, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation. My father froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. For a second, nobody moved. The silence was deafening. I looked frantically at Mark. Say something, I screamed in my head. Defend them, defend your wife, defend my family. Mark looked down at his plate, he cleared his throat. Mom, please, let's just enjoy the turkey. He capitulated, he kept the peace. My father didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply set his spoon down on his designated silver resting plate, completely ignoring the fact that he was supposedly too common to know how to use it. He stood up, towering over the table with the quiet, imposing dignity of a man who actually worked for a living. He walked over to my mother, pulled her chair out, and gently offered her his arm. We appreciate the hospitality, Aliner, my dad said, his voice deadly calm, completely ignoring the stunned looks of the guests. But I think draft horses need to get to bed early. We have real work to do in the morning. He looked at me, a deep sadness in his eyes, gave me a tight nod, and walked my mother out the front door. I sat frozen in my chair. The front door clicked shut. Well, Aliner scoffed, waving her hand to dismiss the awkwardness. So incredibly sensitive. I suppose emotional regulation isn't taught in the public school system. I stood up, my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Sit down, Mark hissed quietly, finally looking at me. Don't ruin the night, they're already gone, just let it go. I looked at my husband, the man I loved, and realized that his desire for peace was entirely built on my constant suffering. I looked at Aliner, sitting at the head of the table, smug, victorious, wrapped in the impenetrable armor of her fake lord. I have a headache, I said, my voice shockingly steady. I'm going home. I didn't wait for Mark. I walked out into the cold November night, the furious, burning tears finally spilling over my cheeks. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch in the dark, my mind racing. Aliner believed she was untouchable because of her history. She believed her blood gave her the right to treat my family like dirt. But Aliner had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. She had spent 5 years weaponizing history against a woman who controlled the archives. I didn't want to keep the peace anymore. I wanted a war. And as the sun began to rise, I opened my laptop, logged into the global genealogical database with my secure archivist credentials, and typed the name Archibald Vance into the search bar. The blinking cursor on my laptop screen felt like a heartbeat in the dark, quiet living room. Outside, the November frost was settling over the neighborhood, freezing the grass into brittle blades of ice, matching the cold, hollow cavern that had opened up in my chest. I had typed Archibald Vance into the database, But for a long time, I just stared at the name. I didn't hit enter. Not yet. I heard the creak of the floorboards upstairs. Mark was awake. A few moments later, he padded down the stairs in his sweatpants, rubbing the back of his neck, looking exhausted and profoundly guilty. He stopped at the edge of the living room, taking in the sight of me sitting exactly where I had been when I walked out of his mother's house hours ago, still wearing my dress, wrapped in a throw blanket. "You've been up all night," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the cursor. I couldn't sleep. Mark sighed, a long, defeated sound that I had come to despise. He walked over and sat on the edge of the coffee table, leaning forward, trying to catch my eye. "Look, I'm sorry about last night. She was out of line. She drank too much, and she was showing off for Beatrice and the country club crowd. She didn't mean to insult your parents like that." I finally turned my head to look at him. The sheer inadequacy of his defense was staggering. "She didn't mean to, Mark. She called them draft horses. She called them sturdy peasant stock. She told a table full of people that she hoped your genetics would overwrite mine, so her precious bloodline wouldn't be contaminated." "It's just talk," Mark pleaded, reaching out to touch my knee. I flinched away. "She's obsessed with this Lord Archibald thing. It's her whole identity. If you push back, she just doubles down. The only way to win with her is not to play. My dad learned that 30 years ago. You just have to let it roll off your back." "My father," I said, my voice dangerously soft, "worked 60-hour weeks in sub-zero trenches so I could sit in a warm classroom. He has more nobility in his scarred knuckles than your mother has in her entire miserable body. And you sat there. You stared at your plate and you let her humiliate them." Mark flushed, looking away. I was trying to keep the peace. "There is no peace, Mark," I whispered. "There is only her walking all over us and you handing her the boots." I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. I wasn't going to do the research here. Not with him hovering, not with him desperate to sweep the shattered pieces of our dignity under the rug. I stood up, walked past him, and went to take a shower. The Cold War had officially begun. For the next 3 weeks, Mark and I lived like polite roommates. He tried to initiate conversations, tried to suggest we go out to dinner, but the ghost of his silence at that Thanksgiving table stood between us like a brick wall. And then, the summons arrived. It wasn't a text or a phone call. Eleanor didn't do anything so pedestrian when she was planning an event. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope, delivered by courier to our house on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside was a piece of custom, gold foil cardstock. I brought it to the kitchen island where Mark was eating a late lunch. I dropped it on the granite counter. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the ornate calligraphy, and I watched the blood drain from his face. "Oh, God," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Read it aloud," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. He cleared his throat. "Eleanor and Richard Vance formally request the honor of your presence at the inaugural Vance Heritage Dinner, a celebration of lineage, legacy, and the enduring spirit of Lord Archibald Vance, to be held at the Oak Creek Country Club, the 15th of February. Black tie strictly required." Mark dropped the card as if it were radioactive. "She's actually doing it. She's been threatening to throw a party for her ancestors for years, but my dad always talked her out of it." "Apparently, your dad lost his veto power," I said dryly. "She's inviting the mayor. She's inviting the Historical Preservation Board. She's inviting half the city council," Mark said, tracing the embossed edges of the invitation. He looked up at me, a pleading, desperate look in his eyes. "We don't have to go. We can say we have a trip planned. We can fake COVID, whatever you want." It was the first time in 5 years he had ever offered to skip one of his mother's events. He was terrified of what would happen if my parents' humiliation was repeated on a grander scale. But I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my skin. "No," I said smoothly. "We're going. It's your family's heritage, Mark. We wouldn't want to miss it." His phone buzzed on the counter before he could respond. It was Eleanor. The caller ID flashed her name alongside a picture of her holding a crystal champagne flute. Mark stared at it, paralyzed, until I reached over and tapped the speaker button. "Mark, darling," Eleanor's voice trilled through the kitchen, sharp and brittle as breaking glass. "I assume you received the invitation. Tell me you're not scheduled to be out of town building a strip mall or whatever it is your firm is doing these days. We got it, Mom, Mark said weakly. We'll be there. Wonderful, now put your wife on. I actually need to speak with her. Mark looked at me, terrified. I leaned in toward the phone, pasting a smile on my face even though she couldn't see it. Hello, Alina. Ah, there you are, she said, her tone instantly cooling, shifting from maternal indulgence to the voice of a manager speaking to an incompetent employee. Now, as you can see, this is going to be a rather significant evening. The country club is opening up the grand ballroom for me. I've secured a string quartet from the symphony. It is going to be an authentic, high society gala, exactly as Lord Archibald would have hosted at his estates in Yorkshire. It sounds very ambitious, I said neutrally. Yes, well, excellence requires ambition, Alina continued. Now, I have a task for you. Since you have those little library skills, and you spend your days rummaging around in old boxes, I thought you might actually be useful for once. Mark hissed through his teeth, reaching for the phone to hang up, but I swatted his hand away. What can I do for you, Alina? I want the centerpieces for the tables to be educational, she declared. I want primary documents. I want copies of Lord Archibald's land deeds from England, the manifest of the grand ship he sailed on when he bravely came to America, and perhaps some of his early business charters here in the States. I want them blown up, printed on high-quality parchment, and framed in gold for the center of every table. I want these people to read the undeniable proof of my family's greatness while they eat their filet mignon. She paused, letting out a short, condescending sigh. I would hire a professional genealogist, of course, but you already have access to the state's databases, don't you? It should save me a few pennies. Consider it your contribution to the family. Goodness knows you couldn't afford to contribute financially to an event of this caliber. I see, I said, my voice betraying absolutely nothing. Just pull the files, print them out, and bring them to me a week before the dinner so I can have the florist arrange the orchids around them, Alina ordered. Oh, and please, wash your hands before you handle the paper. Try not to get your working-class smudges on my family's legacy. Mark buried his face in his hands. I looked at the phone, a genuine, terrifying smile spreading across my face. She was handing me the shovel she wanted me to use to dig her grave. She was practically begging me to drag her skeletons out into the blinding light of the country club ballroom. I would be absolutely honored to research your family's history, Alina, I said, my voice dripping with sweet, lethal compliance. I will dive incredibly deep. I promise you, I will find the undeniable truth of Lord Archibald's legacy, and I will make sure everyone at that dinner sees exactly where you come from. Excellent. See that you do. Ta-ta. The line clicked dead. The next morning, I arrived at the State Historical Society an hour before my shift officially began. The archives are located in the sub-basement of a massive, brutalist concrete building downtown. To most people, it's a dreary, windowless dungeon smelling of ozone, dust, and decaying paper. To me, it is a sanctuary. It is a fortress of facts. Down here, money doesn't matter. Pretense doesn't matter. The only thing that survives the slow, grinding crush of time is the truth, written in ink, stamped by clerks, and buried in acid-free folders. I sat at my workstation, a heavy oak desk surrounded by towering banks of microfiche cabinets and servers connected to international genealogical databases. I powered on my dual monitors, I cracked my knuckles. I was no longer an archivist preserving the past. I was a bloodhound catching a scent. I started where any historian would, the known variables. I had to prove the existence of the man before I could track his movements. I logged into the British National Archives portal, utilizing my institutional access to bypass the paywalls that amateur ancestry websites throw up. I typed in the search parameters, Lord Archibald Vance, Yorkshire, born circa 1805. The database churned for a few seconds before spitting out a list of digitized parish records, peerage directories, and census data. I opened the first file, a high-resolution scan of a leather-bound registry from 1807. There he was, Archibald Julian Vance, born to the Duke and Duchess of... Well, the titles were extensive. I spent the next 4 hours piecing together the legitimate life of a British aristocrat. Alina, to my profound irritation, had not been lying about the man's existence. The Vance family was real, and they were wealthy beyond comprehension. Archibald was the second son, meaning he didn't inherit the primary dukedom, but he was given a sprawling estate in Yorkshire, a massive stipend, and a seat in the lower echelons of the peerage. I pulled his financial records. He was a magistrate, a landowner, and a frequent guest at royal galas. He married a woman of equal standing. He had a signet ring, a crest featuring a rampant lion, and a life of absolute, undeniable privilege. I leaned back in my chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, feeling a knot of frustration tighten in my stomach. Was it true? Was Alina actually descended from this man? If so, my petty revenge fantasy was dead in the water. I would have to print out these glorious records, frame them in gold, and hand them to her so she could use them to bludgeon my parents' memory forever. No, I muttered to the empty basement. Keep digging. I shifted my focus to the emigration. According to Alina's grand mythology, which she repeated ad nauseum, Lord Archibald was forced to flee England in 1842 due to a scandal of honor. Some romanticized nonsense about a duel to protect a lady's virtue that put him on the wrong side of the crown. He supposedly boarded a ship in Liverpool, braved the treacherous Atlantic crossing, and arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on his back, his signet ring, and his indomitable aristocratic spirit, eventually rebuilding his fortune in the American Northeast. I switched databases, moving from the British domestic records to the transatlantic maritime manifests. The 1840s were a massive period of emigration, and the records are notoriously messy, but institutional access allows for cross-referencing that civilian ancestry sites can't match. I queried passenger manifests out of Liverpool between January and December 1842. I searched for the surname Vance. Dozens of hits came back: Irish laborers, Scottish farmers, a few merchants. I filtered by first name: Archibald. One result remained. I clicked the link. A scanned image of a massive, water-stained ledger filled the screen. The handwriting was a sharp, looping cursive. It was the manifest for a ship called the HMS Leviathan, departing Liverpool on October 14, 1842, bound for New York Harbor. I scrolled down the list of passengers. Steerage was packed with hundreds of names, mostly Irish families fleeing the early rumblings of famine. But there, listed in the first-class cabin section, was the entry: Vance Archibald, age 37, occupation gentleman, country of origin Great Britain. My heart sank. There it was, the proof. He had boarded the ship. He had sailed to America. The timeline fit perfectly. The age fit. The status fit. I felt the bitter taste of defeat coating my tongue. Alina was right. I reached for my mouse, ready to download the image and send it to the printer. I would fulfill her smug, degrading request. I would be the obedient, working-class librarian she thought I was. But as my hand rested on the mouse, my eyes drifted back to the screen. As an archivist, you develop a sixth sense for anomalies. It's an itch in the back of your brain when a pattern doesn't perfectly align. Something about the ledger entry bothered me. I looked closer at the scan, zooming in on the column next to Archibald's name. In the column designated for accompanying family, there was a dash. He was traveling alone. I frowned, toggling back to my previous tab containing the British domestic records. I pulled up the 1841 English census, taken just 1 year prior to the voyage. Lord Archibald Vance was listed at his Yorkshire estate, but he wasn't alone. He was listed alongside his wife, Lady Margaret, and their 3 young children. Why would a devoted, wealthy aristocrat flee to America in the middle of the night, taking a first-class cabin, and completely abandon his wife and 3 children? Furthermore, if he was fleeing a scandal of honor, as Alina claimed, why did he travel under his own name, purchasing a highly visible luxury ticket? It didn't make sense. Real life isn't a romance novel. Aristocrats didn't just abandon their massive estates and fortunes to rough it in the New World without a paper trail of bankruptcies or criminal indictments, neither of which I had found in the British archives. I pushed away from my desk and began pacing the narrow aisle between the microfiche cabinets. The hum of the servers seemed to grow louder. What if he didn't leave? I whispered. I practically sprinted back to my chair. If Lord Archibald hadn't abandoned his family, where was he? I needed to look at the end of his life, not the middle. I opened a new tab, logging into the UK General Register Office database. I initiated a death record search for Lord Archibald Vance, Yorkshire. If he died in America, as Aliner's family tree claimed, there would be no British death certificate. I hit enter. The screen flashed white for a microsecond before loading the results. My breath caught in my throat. There was a hit. I clicked the digital file, my hand trembling slightly. A heavy, black-bordered death registry form materialized on my monitor. Name, Archibald Julian Vance, Lord of. Date of death, September 28, 1842. Place of death, the port of Liverpool Quarantine Hospital. Cause of death, cholera morbus. I stared at the date. September 28, 1842. I frantically clicked back to the ship's passenger manifest. The HMS Leviathan departed Liverpool on October 14, 1842. 16 days later. The room suddenly felt incredibly hot. The blood was roaring in my ears. I pulled up a historical epidemiological map of England in 1842. A massive cholera outbreak had swept through the port cities that autumn, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. The wealthy weren't immune. Lord Archibald Vance had traveled to Liverpool, likely on business or perhaps planning a voyage, and he had caught the disease. He died in a quarantine hospital, far from his Yorkshire estate, his body likely burned or buried in a mass lime pit to prevent infection, his personal effects sequestered. He never boarded that ship. He died agonizingly, vomiting and feverish, in a squalid port hospital. So who the hell was standing on the deck of the HMS Leviathan 2 weeks later, holding a first-class ticket in the name of a dead lord? I sat back, the magnitude of the discovery washing over me in a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Aliner's entire existence, her superiority, her cruelty to my parents, it was all built on a ghost. The man who arrived in New York, the man who spawned the American Vance lineage, the man whose portrait hung above her fireplace like a god, was an imposter. But who was he? I needed to know how a stranger got his hands on a dead aristocrat's ticket, his papers, and his identity. I opened a new, highly restricted database, the 19th century British penal and constabulary records. If someone stole the identity of a dead lord in a port city during a plague, they didn't do it legally. I searched the Liverpool constabulary arrest warrants for the weeks between Lord Archibald's death and the ship's departure. I filtered for crimes of theft, identity fraud, and grave robbing. The database spun. It took longer this time, digging through poorly digitized police blotters from the slums of Victorian England. Come on, I prayed, my eyes glued to the loading bar. Give him to me. Give me the rat. The screen populated with a single, massive file. It was a scanned copy of a comprehensive police docket and a wanted poster, dated October 12, 1842, 2 days before the ship sailed. I clicked the image, expanding it across both of my monitors. As I read the heavily inked, furious handwriting of a Victorian police inspector describing the man they were hunting, a slow, dark, and utterly triumphant laugh escaped my lips, echoing through the empty basement archives. I had found him. I had found the real father of the Vance legacy, and he was magnificent. The name on the heavy, black-inked wanted poster was Bartholomew Cobb. I leaned so close to the monitor that I could see the individual pixels making up the digital scan, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The document, issued by the Liverpool Constabulary on October 12, 1842, was a masterpiece of Victorian disgust. It wasn't just a simple arrest warrant. It was a sprawling, furious narrative of a man who was apparently considered a plague upon the city long before the actual cholera arrived. I began to read the inspector's looping, aggressive cursive, my eyes greedily devouring every word. WANTED by the Crown, Bartholomew Cobb. Age, approximately 35. Occupation, stable hand, opportunist, and known associate of pickpockets. Wanted for the grand larceny of a thoroughbred mare belonging to the magistrate of East Derby, public indecency, and fleeing lawful custody. But it was the next paragraph, hastily appended to the bottom of the poster by a different, sloppier hand, that held the golden key to the mystery. Update. The suspect is now believed to be operating within the quarantine zones of the lower docks, having disguised himself as a body hauler to escape the constables. Cobb is highly dangerous, devoid of Christian morals, and is suspected of looting the personal effects, papers, and jewelry of the deceased before depositing their remains in the municipal lime pits. He is known to be in possession of stolen identification papers belonging to the gentry. I sat back in my heavy oak chair, the air in the sub-basement suddenly feeling thin and electric. It was a story so profoundly grotesque, so completely opposite to Aliner's manicured, fairy tale mythology, that for a moment, I could only stare at the ceiling and try to process the sheer magnitude of the lie. Lord Archibald Vance, the great aristocrat, hadn't bravely sailed to America to start a new legacy. He had died in a filthy quarantine tent, choking on his own fluids, completely alone. And while his body was still warm, a foul-mouthed, illiterate horse thief named Bartholomew Cobb had dug through his pockets. Cobb had taken the first-class ticket. He had taken the signet ring with the rampant lion. He had taken the letters of introduction, the pocket watch, and the name. He had stripped a dead lord of his identity, walked onto the HMS Leviathan 2 days later, and sailed away to invent a dynasty. "You magnificent, terrible bastard," I whispered to the pixelated ghost of Bartholomew Cobb, but I was an archivist. A compelling narrative, even one backed by police blotters, was circumstantial. To destroy Aliner Vance, I couldn't just present a plausible theory. I needed ironclad, undeniable DNA-level proof that the man who lived and died in America as Lord Archibald Vance was, without a shadow of a doubt, the horse thief. If there was even a fraction of a millimeter of wiggle room, Aliner would exploit it. She would claim it was a coincidence, or a lie fabricated by a jealous lower-class daughter-in-law. I needed a physical anchor. I looked back at the wanted poster, scanning down to the physical description of the suspect. Victorian police records didn't have fingerprints or photographs, so they relied heavily on distinguishing scars and deformities to identify repeat offenders. Description: the ledger read: stature, 5 feet 9 inches. Build, wiry. Complexion, pockmarked and ruddy. Distinguishing marks: the suspect bears the crude brand of the letter T for thief upon his right anterior shoulder, administered by the courts of York in 1836. Furthermore, the suspect is entirely lacking his left earlobe, having had it bitten off in a tavern brawl in the winter of 1839. I copied the description verbatim into my notebook, underlining branded T on right shoulder and missing left earlobe 3 times. Now, I had to find a medical record for the American Lord Vance. This was going to be incredibly difficult. In the mid-19th century, medical records were sparse, and autopsy reports for wealthy, seemingly respectable citizens who died of natural causes were rare. I spent the next 4 days living in the archives. I drank so much black coffee my hands shook permanently. I barely saw Mark, coming home long after he was asleep and leaving before he woke. I was a woman possessed. I tracked Lord Archibald's life in America. He had settled in upstate New York, using the stolen wealth and signet ring to buy his way into local high society. He purchased land, started a lumber mill, and married the daughter of a wealthy merchant, Aliner's great-great-grandmother. He lived a life of stolen luxury until his death in 1874. I needed a doctor's note from between 1842 and 1874. I dug through military draft registries from the Civil War, but he was too old to serve. I dug through property disputes, hoping for a mention of his physical appearance in court transcripts. Nothing. On the 5th day, exhausted and nursing a migraine that pulsed behind my eyes, I found the back door: life insurance. In the 1860s, the American life insurance industry boomed. Wealthy men bought massive policies to secure their estates. And to buy a massive policy, you had to submit to a comprehensive physical examination by a company physician to prove you weren't hiding a terminal illness. I logged into the digitized corporate archives of the New York Mutual Life Insurance Company, which had recently been absorbed into a massive, searchable state historical database. I searched for Archibald Vance, applying for a policy between 1860 and 1870. A file popped up. Policy application, 44,092. Date, May 12, 1868. Applicant: Archibald J. Vance. My fingers practically hovered over the keyboard as I requested the high-resolution scan of the physician's intake examination. The image loaded slowly, line by line, revealing the elegant, spidery handwriting of a Dr. Silas Thorne. Applicant appears in robust health for a man of his stated years, Dr. Thorne wrote. Heart and lungs sound clear, no signs of consumption or dropsy. I scrolled down to the section labeled Noteworthy physical characteristics/scars/deformities. I stopped breathing. The silence in the subbasement was total. The applicant presents with a peculiar, ancient burn scar on the right anterior shoulder, roughly in the shape of a cross or the letter T, which he claims was the result of a childhood accident with a fireplace iron. My eyes darted to the next line. Furthermore, the applicant's left ear is disfigured, entirely lacking the fleshy lobe. Applicant states this was a wound sustained during a fencing bout in his youth in England. I slammed my hands down on the desk so hard the coffee cup rattled against my keyboard. A wild, breathless laugh ripped out of my throat. It was a perfect match. The branded shoulder, the bitten-off earlobe, it was the genetic smoking gun. The man buried in the Vance family plot beneath a massive marble obelisk wasn't a lord. He was Bartholomew Cobb, the pockmarked, branded, earless horse thief from the slums of Liverpool. I spent the next 48 hours building the ultimate arsenal. I didn't just want to expose her, I wanted to drown her in primary sources. I pulled the court docket from York, where Cobb was branded. I pulled the prison transfer logs. I pulled the original arrest warrant for stealing the magistrate's horse. I compiled 22 pages of undeniable, historically verified criminal records, completely dismantling the Vance family tree branch by branch. Now came the true artistry, the malicious compliance. Eleanor had demanded a book. She had explicitly requested that I use my little library skills to create a centerpiece filled with primary documents to prove her family's greatness to her high society friends. She had demanded high-quality parchment. She had demanded gold. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I took a week of personal leave from the Historical Society. I needed time, and I needed absolute secrecy. I took my digital files to a bespoke, high-end bookbinder located in the wealthy historic district of the city, a craftsman who usually bound, restored first editions for private collectors. When I walked into his shop, smelling of old paper and leather conditioner, the binder, a meticulous older man named Elias, looked at my flash drive skeptically. I need a custom binding, I told him, placing my credit card on the counter. I need it to look like a royal artifact. The heaviest, most luxurious Moroccan leather you have. I want the pages printed on thick, cream-colored archival cotton paper with deckled edges. And I want the cover heavily embossed in 24-karat gold leaf. Elias raised an eyebrow. That is an incredibly expensive commission, madam. What is the text? It's a genealogical history, I said, my face completely deadpan. A definitive record of my mother-in-law's heritage. It is a gift for a very public gala. It needs to be flawless. Elias nodded, his professional interest piqued. We spent hours selecting the typography. I chose Caslin, an elegant, highly readable serif font that screamed old-world wealth. I formatted the book meticulously. The first few pages were deceptively beautiful. A gorgeous title page, The True Heritage of the Vance Lineage. A definitive history. I even included a high-resolution scan of the fake family crest she loved so much. But turn the page, and the slaughter began. I didn't alter a single historical document. I just presented them in their raw, devastating glory, translated and transcribed below the original scans for easy reading. Page 4. The 1842 wanted poster for Bartholomew Cobb, horse thief. Page 6. The quarantine hospital death certificate of the real Lord Archibald Vance. Page 8. The 1868 mutual life insurance medical examination, highlighting the matching criminal brand and the missing earlobe. Page 10. The 1836 York Assizes Court conviction for larceny and public indecency. It was a beautiful, devastating Trojan horse. From the outside, it looked like a Bible of high society. On the inside, it was a rap sheet of a serial felon. I also need supplements, I told Elias, pulling out another file. Eleanor wanted the guests to have something to take home. I need 50 presentation folders. Thick, glossy navy blue cardstock. Inside each folder, I want a high-quality reproduction of the 1842 wanted poster and a brief, one-page summary of the medical evidence proving the identity theft. Elias looked at the files on his monitor. He read the wanted poster. He read the medical report. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He realized exactly what I was building. A slow, conspiratorial smile spread across his face. "Madam," Elias whispered, "this is a weapon of mass destruction." "Yes," I agreed softly. "Can you have it done by the 14th? "For this," he said, his eyes gleaming with the vicious joy of a true craftsman, "I will work nights." The cost was exorbitant, almost $3,000. I drained my personal savings account to pay for it. I didn't care. To me, it was the cheapest therapy I had ever purchased. While Elias worked on the book, I had to manage the home front. Keeping Mark in the dark was both terrifyingly easy and deeply depressing. He was so incredibly anxious about the upcoming heritage dinner that he was practically vibrating with nervous energy, but he never once asked about the details of my research. He just wanted to know that I was obeying his mother's orders. "How are the centerpieces coming?" he asked one evening over dinner, exactly 1 week before the gala. He was aggressively cutting his chicken, avoiding eye contact. "They're done," I said smoothly, taking a sip of wine. "I'm having them professionally bound and printed. The book is going to be the absolute center of attention, Mark. I promise you, your mother has never seen anything like it. It is going to leave her completely speechless." Mark let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders visibly dropping. "Thank God. Thank you, babe. I know she was awful at Thanksgiving, and I know she asked a lot of you with this project. It means the world to me that you're taking the high road and just giving her what she wants. It'll make the night go so smoothly. We just go in, she brags about her lord, we eat our steak, and we leave." "Exactly," I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. "She'll get to share her true history with everyone she respects. It's going to be a night they will talk about for the rest of their lives." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I let him, feeling nothing but cold, smooth detachment. He thought I had capitulated. He thought I was the obedient, broken-in wife who had finally learned her place in the Vance hierarchy. He didn't know he was sleeping next to an assassin. The day before the gala, I drove to Elia's shop to pick up the commission. When he placed the book on the counter, it took my breath away. It was a masterpiece. The Moroccan leather was a deep, rich crimson, soft and heavy to the touch. The gold foil stamping caught the light, gleaming with an arrogant, wealthy luster. It felt like a tome pulled from the restricted section of a royal library. Beside it sat a heavy cardboard box containing 50 beautiful, navy blue presentation folders, tied neatly with gold ribbons. "It is flawless," I told Elias, running my fingertips over the embossed title. "It is dangerous," he corrected gently, handing me the receipt. "Good luck, madam, may your aim be true." I drove home with the box hidden in the trunk of my car. I hid it in the back of my closet, buried under winter coats, right next to the dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I had chosen a floor-length, deep emerald gown. It was elegant, understated, and completely perfect for a funeral. The 15th of February arrived with a bitter, biting cold that seemed to snap the air in half. The sky was a pale, bruised purple as the sun set over the city. In our master bathroom, the tension was suffocating. Mark was wrestling with his bow tie, his hands shaking slightly. He had been pacing for an hour, terrified that something would go wrong, terrified that his mother would find a reason to be displeased. "We need to leave in 10 minutes, he called out, his voice tight. "Did you pack the documents she asked for?" I stood before the full-length mirror. I looked different. The soft, accommodating girl who had smiled through 5 years of insults was gone. My posture was perfectly straight. My makeup was sharp and precise. I looked like a woman who had spent $3,000 and 100 hours of labor to forge a guillotine out of paper and gold. "I have the book, Mark," I said, my voice eerily calm, resonating through the tiled bathroom. I walked to the closet and retrieved the heavy leather tome, cradling it in my arms like a newborn child. I picked up the sleek black tote bag containing the 50 presentation folders. I walked out into the bedroom. Mark turned around, adjusting his cuffs, and stopped dead. He looked at the book in my hands, his eyes widening at the sheer, undeniable quality of it. "Wow," he breathed, stepping closer. "That looks incredible. My mother is going to lose her mind when she sees that. She's going to love it." "I know," I said, staring directly into his eyes, feeling the cold, unyielding metal of the trap finally lock into place. "She asked for the truth, and I'm going to give it to her." I walked past him, down the stairs, and out into the freezing night, ready to watch the Vance empire burn. The drive to the Oak Creek Country Club took exactly 32 minutes, and for the entirety of that journey, the silence inside Mark's Audi was absolute. Outside, the frozen February landscape slipped past the heated windows in a blur of skeletal trees and yellow streetlights. The heater hummed a low, monotonous drone, a stark contrast to the chaotic, terrified energy radiating off my husband. He kept checking his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting his tie, running a hand through his hair. He was a man going to the gallows, hoping against hope that the executioner would simply forget to show up. I, on the other hand, felt a profound, terrifying stillness. The crimson leather book rested heavily in my lap, its gold-embossed cover cool against my fingertips. In the trunk, the sleek black tote bag held 50 identical navy blue folders. I had never felt so powerful in my entire life. The anxiety that had plagued me for 5 years, the constant, desperate need to be accepted by this family, the fear of doing or saying the wrong thing, the suffocating pressure of keeping the peace, it was all gone. It had burned away, leaving nothing but cold, crystalline purpose. We pulled up to the grand, pillared entrance of the country club. The building was an imposing monument to old money, constructed of heavy gray stone and flanked by massive, dormant oak trees. Valets in crisp white jackets hurried out to open our doors. The air outside was bitter, slicing through my thin coat, but I barely felt it. I clutched the book to my chest and walked up the sweeping marble steps, Mark trailing half a step behind me like a nervous shadow. The interior of the Oak Creek Country Club was aggressively opulent. The foyer was dominated by a massive, tiered crystal chandelier that threw fractured light across the polished marble floors. A string quartet was set up in the corner, playing a delicate, overly polite rendition of a Vivaldi concerto. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the sharp tang of high-end perfume. And there, holding court at the entrance to the grand ballroom, was a leaner. She looked as though she were attending a coronation rather than a dinner party. She wore a floor-length gown of heavy, shimmering silver silk, her neck and wrists weighed down by diamonds that I was certain had been rented for the occasion. Her hair was styled in an elaborate, stiff updo that defied gravity, and her posture was so rigidly straight it looked painful. Beside her stood Richard, my father-in-law, looking like a deflated balloon stuffed into a tuxedo. He held a glass of scotch with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes glazed over as he endured the evening. "Ah, the late arrivals," Eleanor projected over the music as we approached. She didn't hug Mark. She merely offered her cheek for him to kiss. When her eyes landed on me, they narrowed slightly, assessing my emerald gown before flicking down to the heavy book in my arms. "I brought the heritage materials you requested, Eleanor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly deferential. "I have something for every table and a centerpiece for you." Eleanor's eyes lit up with genuine, greedy delight. She reached out and ran a manicured finger over the gold leaf lettering on the leather cover. "The true heritage of the Vance lineage, a definitive history." "Oh, my word," she breathed, her facade of bored superiority cracking for just a fraction of a second. This is exquisite. I must admit, I am surprised. I expected a few printouts in cheap plastic frames. You actually managed to create something tasteful." "I spared no expense," I told her, looking her dead in the eye. "I wanted it to accurately reflect the true weight of your family's legacy." "Excellent," she purred, turning away to flag down a passing waiter. "Give the table materials to the maitre d'. I want them placed at every seat immediately. Keep that book with you. You will present it to me formally during my address. Go mingle, try not to hover near the buffet." I found the maitre d', a sharp-eyed man named Henry, and handed him the black tote bag from the coat check. I instructed him to place one navy blue folder exactly in the center of every guest's plate, replacing the standard menu cards. I told him it was a special surprise from the hostess. He nodded crisply and dispatched his staff to execute the order. For the next hour, cocktail hour dragged on. I stood near the perimeter of the room, sipping sparkling water, watching the elite of our city gather to celebrate a ghost. The guest list was a who's who of local power and pretension. I recognized the mayor, a ruddy-faced man who was currently laughing loudly at one of Aliner's jokes. I saw Beatrice, the woman from Thanksgiving, dripping in pearls and inspecting the ice sculptures, which were, absurdly, carved into the shape of rampant lions, mirroring the fake Vance crest. Mark spent the hour apologizing for my absence to people who barely knew I existed, desperately trying to project the image of a happy, unified family. I watched him shrink into himself, laughing at the belittling jokes of his mother's friends, nodding along as they made passive-aggressive comments about the changing demographics of the city. He was surviving the only way he knew how. It broke my heart, just a little, but it also hardened my resolve. He needed this explosion just as much as I did. He needed the illusion shattered so he could finally breathe. At 8 o'clock, the chimes rang, signaling the guests to take their seats for dinner. The grand ballroom was breathtakingly pretentious. 5 long, rectangular tables were draped in heavy white linen and groaning under the weight of silver candelabras and towering centerpieces of white orchids. At every single place setting, resting perfectly atop the gold-rimmed charger plates, was a sleek, closed, navy blue folder tied with a gold ribbon. As the 50 guests found their seats, a murmur of curiosity rippled through the room. People picked up the folders, weighing them in their hands, admiring the expensive cardstock. "Do not open them yet." Aliner's voice rang out from the head table, amplified by a microphone she had eagerly commandeered. She tapped her crystal water glass with a silver spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The room fell silent. 50 faces turned toward Aliner. I was seated at the far right end of the head table, the crimson book resting heavily in my lap. Mark was seated next to me, visibly sweating. "Welcome, my dear friends, esteemed colleagues and honored guests," Aliner began, her voice dripping with practiced, theatrical grace. "Tonight is not merely a dinner. Tonight is a celebration of history. It is a celebration of endurance, of excellence, and most importantly, of blood." I watched Beatrice nod sagely from table 3. The mayor took a sip of his wine, looking politely engaged. "In an era where the concept of legacy is so carelessly discarded," Aliner continued, pacing slightly behind the head table, "we must remember that greatness is not an accident. It is cultivated." My ancestor, Lord Archibald Vance, understood this. He was a man of the highest British aristocracy, a man who sacrificed his massive estates, his comfort, and his position at the royal court to cross a treacherous ocean. He came to America not as a beggar, but as a king without a throne, bringing with him the untainted, superior lineage that built this very community. She paused, placing a hand over her heart, looking out over the sea of faces with an expression of profound, sickening self-importance. "We are surrounded by commonality," she preached, her voice dropping into a tone of conspiratorial disgust. "We see it every day. People who lack the inherent, genetic refinement to appreciate true culture. People who are content to wallow in mediocrity. But we, the people in this room, we understand that pedigree matters. It dictates our character. It dictates our destiny." The Vance bloodline has remained pure, a beacon of aristocratic excellence in a sea of sturdy, unremarkable peasant stock. I felt my fingernails dig into the leather cover of the book. I thought of my father's calloused hands. I thought of my mother's humiliation at Thanksgiving. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into pure, freezing ice. "To commemorate this legacy," Aliner announced, turning her gaze toward me with a triumphant, condescending smile, "I tasked my daughter-in-law, who works in the historical archives, to gather the primary documents of Lord Archibald's life. I wanted undeniable, historical proof of our greatness to share with all of you, and she has compiled it into a beautiful, definitive history." Aliner gestured grandly to me. "Stand up, dear, bring the book forward. Let everyone see the history of your betters." Mark put a hand on my knee under the table, squeezing hard in a silent plea. "Just do it. Just hand it over." I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown. I picked up the heavy, crimson leather book. The room was dead silent, all eyes fixed on me as I walked behind the head table and approached Alina. I stopped a foot away from her. I held the book out. She took it with both hands, reverently. She turned it around to show the room the gold-embossed cover. A polite smattering of applause broke out. "It truly is magnificent," Alina gloated, looking at me with a smirk. "Now, before we open the table gifts, I want you to read the first entry. Read to the room the glorious tale of Lord Archibald's arrival. Let them hear the unvarnished, historical truth of my bloodline." She flipped the heavy leather cover open. She bypassed the title page and opened it directly to the first primary document. She handed the open book back to me, expecting me to read a tale of heroism. She hadn't looked at the page. She was too busy basking in the glow of her audience. I took the book. I looked down at the page. The massive, blown-up, high-resolution scan of the 1842 police docket stared back at me. Below it, printed in elegant Caslin font, was my meticulous transcription. I looked out at the 50 guests. I looked at Mark, who was smiling nervously. I looked at Alina, who was waiting with her chin held high. "The historical truth," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly into the microphone. "As recorded by the Crown's Constabulary in Liverpool, England, on October the 12th, 1842. Alina nodded encouragingly. I began to read. I didn't rush. I enunciated every single syllable with the crisp, professional diction of an archivist presenting a peer-reviewed paper. "Wanted by the Crown. Bartholomew Cobb," I read, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom. Alina frowned slightly. She leaned closer to me, her brow furrowing. "What? No, skip the introduction, read the part about Archibald." I ignored her. I raised my volume just a fraction, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Age, approximately 35. Occupation, stable hand, opportunist, and known associate of pickpockets. Wanted for the grand larceny of a thoroughbred mare, public indecency, and fleeing lawful custody." A strange, confused ripple moved through the tables. The mayor paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Beatrice looked around, blinking rapidly. "What are you doing?" Alina hissed, her voice panicked, dropping the microphone etiquette entirely. She reached for the book. I stepped neatly out of her reach, continuing to read over the speakers. "The suspect, Bartholomew Cobb, is now believed to be operating within the quarantine zones of the lower docks." I recited flawlessly, my eyes tracking the elegant typography. "He is highly dangerous, devoid of Christian morals, and is suspected of looting the personal effects, papers, and jewelry of the deceased before depositing their remains in the municipal lime pits." "Stop," Alina commanded, her voice cracking. "Turn the microphone off. What is this garbage? What are you reading?" "I am reading the unvarnished, historical truth of your bloodline, Alina," I said into the microphone, before raising my voice to address the room directly. "The man who arrived in America was not Lord Archibald Vance. The real Lord Archibald died of cholera in a quarantine tent 2 weeks before the ship sailed. The man who stole his ticket, his signet ring, and his identity to escape the hanging judge was Bartholomew Cobb, an illiterate horse thief." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. You could hear the faint, ambient hum of the HVAC system. "You're lying," Alina shrieked, the aristocratic facade completely shattered. Her face flushed a violent, mottled purple. She lunged at me, trying to snatch the book. "You spiteful, jealous little peasant, you fabricated this." "I am a historian," I said, my voice dead calm, effortlessly stepping aside as she stumbled against the podium. "I do not fabricate. And because I knew you would accuse me of such, I ensured there was zero room for denial. Please, everyone, open your folders." At table 2, the mayor untied the gold ribbon. At table 3, Beatrice opened the glossy navy blue cover. All across the room, 50 of the city's most elite, snobbish socialites opened the files. "Inside," I narrated, acting as their expert guide through the destruction of the Vance Empire, "you will find the 1842 wanted poster detailing Bartholomew Cobb's physical deformities. Specifically, a crude T for thief, branded into his right shoulder by the courts of York, and a missing left earlobe, bitten off in a tavern brawl." The rustling of paper filled the room, As guests flipped to the second page. You will also find, I continued relentlessly, a certified copy of the 1868 New York Mutual Life Insurance medical examination for the man you know as Lord Archibald Vance. Signed by Dr. Silas Thorne. In it, the doctor meticulously details a deep, ancient burn scar on the right shoulder in the shape of a T and the complete absence of the left earlobe. I looked at Alina. She was frozen, leaning against the table, staring out at the guests. It is a perfect, undeniable genetic match, I said softly, the microphone picking up the quiet devastation in my tone. Your ancestor wasn't a thoroughbred, Alina. He was a parasite who robbed a corpse. And every ounce of superiority you've claimed, every insult you've hurled at my working-class family, was built on the stolen valor of a dead man and the crimes of a fugitive. For 5 seconds nobody moved. Then, Beatrice, sitting at table 3, let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. She slapped a hand over her mouth immediately, but the damage was done. The mayor lowered his folder, looked directly at Richard Vance, and shook his head in a mixture of pity and intense second-hand embarrassment. Whispers broke out, the quiet, insidious whispering of the upper class when they smell blood in the water, a horse thief, ... branded like cattle, all those speeches about blood purity. Alina broke. She didn't faint elegantly like a Victorian lady. She didn't maintain her composure. She threw a spectacular, unhinged, feral tantrum that would have made Bartholomew Cobb proud. Give me those, she screamed, lunging away from the head table and charging toward the mayor. She grabbed the folder out of his hands, tearing the high-quality cardstock in half. It's a lie. She's a jealous, poor, pathetic liar. Don't look at it, give them to me. She ran down the aisle between the tables, her silver gown tangling around her legs, snatching folders from the hands of the stunned socialites. She was screeching, her elaborate updo collapsing, strands of hair falling into her face. She looked manic, she looked entirely deranged. Mom, stop. The voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. Mark stood up from his chair at the end of the head table. He was holding his own copy of the folder. He was staring at the medical examination, his face pale, his eyes reading the undeniable proof of the brand and the missing ear. He looked up at his mother, who was currently wrestling a folder away from the wife of the city councilman. Mom, stop it, Mark said again, his voice cracking slightly. It's over. Look at the papers. It's real. It's all real. Alina froze, clutching a fistful of torn folders to her chest, breathing heavily. She looked at her son, her eyes wide and wild. Mark, defend me, throw her out. Defend your bloodline. Mark looked at her, and then he looked at me. For 5 years, I had watched this man fold under pressure. I had watched him prioritize his mother's comfort over my dignity. I watched him keep the peace at all costs. But looking at his mother now, reduced to a screaming, vicious fraud in front of everyone she worshipped, the spell finally broke. He dropped the folder onto the table. There is no bloodline, Mom, Mark said quietly, the exhaustion in his voice palpable. You've been terrorizing my wife and her family for years over a lie. You insulted Frank and Helen. You called them draft horses. All while you were worshipping a criminal. He turned to me. The guilt and the profound realization in his eyes were heavy. He reached out and gently touched my arm. I'm sorry, he whispered to me. I am so sorry I let it get to this point. He turned back to his mother. We're leaving. You can't leave, Alina shrieked, dropping the torn papers onto the floor. Richard, do something. Richard Vance, sitting quietly at his place setting, finally finished his glass of scotch. He set the crystal tumbler down with a soft click. He looked at the chaos, looked at the folders, and let out a long, heavy sigh. Frankly, Alina, Richard said, his voice carrying the weary weight of a 30-year sentence coming to an end, I always preferred horses to lords anyway. Sit down, you're making a scene. Mark didn't wait to see if she sat down. He put his hand on the small of my back and guided me away from the head table. I didn't look back at Alina. I held my head high, the heavy, beautiful crimson book tucked securely under my arm. We walked down the center aisle, past the mayor, past Beatrice, past 50 people who were now furiously reading the criminal history of the Vance family. The silence had been replaced by a chaotic symphony of murmurs and stifled laughter. We walked out of the ballroom, across the marble foyer, and out into the freezing February night. The valet brought the Audi around. We got in, and Mark pulled away from the Oak Creek Country Club, leaving the burning ruins of his mother's empire in the rearview mirror. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the terrified silence of the journey there. It was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed, leaving the air clean and breathable. When we got home, Mark didn't go to sleep. He sat at the kitchen island, poured himself a glass of water, and asked me to show him the raw files. I opened my laptop and walked him through the archives. I showed him the ship manifests, the cholera death records, the police blotters, and the life insurance policy. We sat there until 4 in the morning, dismantling the mythology he had been raised on. When it was over, he cried. He didn't cry for the loss of his aristocratic heritage. He cried for the 5 years of abuse he had allowed me to endure for the sake of a phantom. He apologized until his voice gave out, promising that things would change. And they did. The fallout was apocalyptic. Eleanor was immediately, thoroughly, and ruthlessly exiled from her high society circles. In the world of old money, nothing is more unforgivable than being a poor imposter. Beatrice and the country club wives turned on her with the ferocity of starved wolves. Eleanor's invitations dried up. Her memberships were politely but firmly suggested to be not renewed. She became the ultimate laughingstock of the city's elite. The story of the Heritage Dinner became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at every gala and charity ball. Richard eventually moved to a condo in Florida, taking his golf clubs and leaving Eleanor to wander the echoing halls of her faux Victorian McMansion entirely alone, staring up at the oil portrait of a horse thief. Mark went to therapy. He learned how to establish boundaries. He cut contact with his mother entirely for 6 months, refusing to answer her frantic, angry phone calls. When he finally did reestablish a relationship, it was strictly on our terms. We saw her briefly, on neutral ground, twice a year. If she made a single disparaging comment, we got up and walked out. My parents were initially shocked when I told them what I had done, but my father simply laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled our living room. "Well," he had said, clapping me on the shoulder, "I guess it takes a draft horse to haul away the garbage." Life returned to normal. I went back to the archives, back to the quiet, dusty preservation of the truth. Mark and I healed, our marriage stronger without the suffocating weight of the Vance legacy pressing down on us. I never brought the subject up with Eleanor directly again. I didn't need to. The silence was victory enough. But I am still human, and I am still capable of a little petty joy. Every December, without fail, I go to a specialty stationery store downtown. I pick out their finest, most expensive holiday card. And every year, I mail Eleanor a beautiful, gold-embossed greeting card featuring a majestic, wild thoroughbred horse, with a single, handwritten message inside. "Remember your roots. Happy holidays."